To begin the second half of today's proceedings momentarily. So if I could ask you to take your seats, please. If I could please ask you to take your seats so we can begin. We have quite a few interesting plenary sessions for you to enjoy and absorb. So I'm going to get going. If I could, I think I'm allowed to start. Am I not? Well, I'm just going to start. Okay. So, following the lunch break, we're going to go into a plenary session. This is the plenary session number 2. Before we go in, I have to tell you some housekeeping. I mentioned before that there are antigen tests available outside at the hotel, so please make sure you get your antigen tests. If you don't get your antigen tests, you won't be allowed to enter tomorrow. You can also get them at one of the 9 hotels where people are residing. I'm told, due to security issues, that this room has to be vacated by 7 p.m. tonight. So no mingling in this room after 7 p.m. It's currently approaching 4 p.m. right now. So within that time, we'll begin with a plenary session 2. And this is looking at the implications of the Ukraine crisis for African economies and trade. We heard a lot from a lot of speakers, including the excellent intervention from Mike Spence, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, who said that these types of shocks that we're seeing, like COVID and the Ukraine crisis, are here to stay. In a way, he was telling us this is the new normal. This is the new world. So the question is, what are the implications of the Ukrainian crisis on African economies and trade? And I'm delighted to invite, to get us started, to give us a 10 to 15 minute sort of speech to soften the ground, so to speak, none other than the chairman of Southbridge Group, and you will also know him as the former president of the African Development Bank, His Excellency Dr. Donald Kaberuka, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, moderator, for your kind words. I'm sure you have been hearing a lot about this issue the whole morning, this afternoon. I've been given 15 minutes, and I want to be strictly within that time limitations. Now, I want to So this round to begin by saying to you that this crisis is serious. That I've been told. It's crisis because it involves a superpower. It has a lot of impact on our economies. And by the way, it is the first time attempts have been made to sanction a very large economy. Of course, in the scheme of things, Russia is big, but it's relative. It's only half the size of the UK. Its economic size is somewhere between Brazil and South Korea. But it's still a major economy at 1.46 trillion GDP, which makes them the 11th largest economy in the world. But it so happens the region we're talking about produces 30% of the wheat, 20% of the barley, of the oils, and as I've heard, a lot of fertilizers. But here is my first point. Maybe I was not here to hear Mike Spence, but I'll be saying basically the same thing. Crises are still with us. We're now focusing on Ukraine and Russia, but there are ongoing crises in Africa which has been forgotten. They've been forgotten, but they are no less important than this particular crisis. I can talk about the pandemic, which is not over, the security crisis in the Sahel, in West Africa, the issues in the global supply chains, And of course, export bans, which affects other products other than wheat and barley. These crises are still with us. They have not gone anywhere. And they too affect our economies, sometimes even more than what we're discussing. Now, there have been a lot of studies, excellent studies done on the issues which arise from this crisis, and I have no intention of going through them. I know one study done by Brookings Institutions, which I want to recommend to you, which has done the study on the effect on the energy markets, on payments, currencies, global supply chains, the risk of decoupling, and the issues which I've been discussing around the social tension. So let me recommend that study for you. It is here. Yeah, it has been done by Brookings just in the last 1 month. It says everything you want to know, especially central bank governors who are here. I highly recommend this particular publication. It is first in class. And it says everything because of the SWIFT issues, sanctions on the dollar, to an extent on the euro, and so on. It is all there. And then there's another study which has been done by Brookings as well, which talks about all these issues which we have been discussing. So instead of repeating them, I just mentioned maybe one or two. Let me talk about the issue of food and remind everyone in this room of what the Nobel Prize winner, Amartya Sen, said. His thesis was about famine in Bengal a long time ago. Essentially, he posited that what causes famines is not usually food shortage as such. It is purchasing power, what he called entitlement. In other words, food might be available in plenty, but actually people will die because of inflation. People will die because their purchasing power has declined. And therefore, we have an issue of addressing availability of food, all right, getting the markets to function, but we have got a bigger issue of addressing ability of 260 million people around the world to be able to buy that food when it becomes available. And that is a macroeconomic question. It means, therefore, we need to work on these issues around availability of food, but also about ability of the 200 million people to be able to purchase that food when it is available. I want to say the same, by the way, for energy. It is the same. Energy might be available, but not affordable to millions of people. And so we need to keep the two in balance. The physical problem we're facing now because of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, but also the macroeconomic consequences of the pandemic, of security in the Sahel, which means that millions of people are not able to afford food even when it is available. Now, I want to make a second point, and I promise that I'm going to respect my time. Take a look at that chart. I've tried to count how many crises we have faced in the last 40 years, and I've just selected a few. Except I can't see them very well, I'm sitting too far from my own chart. You forgive me, but I'm sure you can see them. Let me see if I have them from my presentation. But just take a look at them. We had the crisis in 1972 when President Nixon devalued the dollar and ended the fixed exchange rate regime, thereby technically ending the Bretton Woods agreements, at least on currencies. A year later, we had the global oil crisis. The price of oil quadrupled in 1 year, 4 times in 1 year. All right? Then I have showed you what happened thereafter in 1989, where the crisis, or rather a good crisis, the Berlin Wall, with the impact that Africa became marginalized for the first time, really marginalized. Then we had another crisis here, the Asian financial crisis, 1997. We are not affected directly, but it shows the ability of the emerging markets to react to a crisis. We had then 9/11, of course, when you had global finance in 2008. You had the issues in North Africa in 2010. You had Ebola 2014, COVID-19, now this one. Who knows what the next crisis will be? Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because the art of economic policy making is not avoiding crises. It's only being ready to manage them, building the resilience you need in case a crisis appears. I think this is what Max Pence was telling you. It is very important we understand this and internalize it. We don't know what the next crisis could be. The one we are living now comes from the geopolitical tensions, but the previous one came from the pandemics, maybe contact between man and animals and viruses. The previous one was caused by the financial markets. Who knows what the next one will be? So the art is about not avoiding crises, but being ready to face them and address them when they arrive. So the issue I want to ask here will be, how have we always responded to this crisis compared to how other regions have responded to crisis? I want to dwell a bit on the next one, which will be familiar to central bank governors here. Go back to the decision on the dollar. That decision on the dollar was extremely important for the financial markets. And it led to a geography, a taxonomy, where you had countries in the north struggling with stagflation, stagnation, and inflation, struggling with the energy security like they're doing now. Countries in the south, especially Latin America, suffering a massive debt crisis, and we in Africa beginning 35 years of decline in real per capita income. The combined effect of the dollar devaluation and the first oil crisis. How did we react? Each time I go back to figure out how we reacted, I think probably we could have mitigated for that particular crisis. So that you are very familiar with, I mean, the kind of disequilibrium that is created in the financial markets is something which should be familiar to all of you. As I have no time, I want to rush quickly. Then I just mentioned the fall of the Berlin Wall. You can see there's a famous book which many of you know. It's called The End of History, Professor Francis Fukuyama. Nowadays he says he was misunderstood. But for him, the Western liberal model had won, other models had lost, all right? So all of us, all we had to do was to compete to neoliberalism and all be very fine. It wasn't. But it began a long process of marginalization of Africa, combined with disease burden, debt. Who cared about Africa at the time? No one, very few. In fact, the word then was, this was a lost decade, a decade of Afro-pessimism. I'll take you to the next one. Believe me, moderator, I respect my time. But look at the Asian financial crisis. It was not here. It didn't even affect us very much. But look at the way the Asian emerging countries managed that crisis. Magnificent. Some less well than others. You can compare Indonesia and Malaysia, what they did on the capital account and many other things you should know very well. There was some art there and a lot of science on how you handle the crisis. As I've told, I have to rush. I need to do that quickly. 9/11, I don't have to go through that. The geopolitical, geoeconomic consequences of what happened. Another crisis. Now, fast forward. This one would be very familiar to many of us, including many of you governors. So, what was said was that Africa would be the continent most affected by the global financial crisis. I recall giving a speech at the time. I was still president of the FTB, and I said, I don't believe so. It will depend upon what we do. And so what I did, maybe some of you are there, I convened a meeting of the African finance ministers and central bank governors to Tunis. And I said, we need a strategy. We need a strategy. And many of us did the right things, especially because we didn't have a lot of these toxic products in our banking sector. But in the real sector, we're highly affected through the transmission mechanism of exports and capital flows. But we did the right things. And by doing the right things, as the IMF likes to put it, we emerged bruised, but we recovered nonetheless. Not everywhere, but we did recover. Then there was the crisis in North Africa, in the wider Middle East. Why am I saying this, my friends? This was not an economic crisis. It was much broader, and I think in front of our guests, they understand that better than I. But I'm telling you that the impact on Libya has had huge economic, social impact in the rest of Africa. I'm not saying just political. Huge economic, social impact in the whole of West Africa. In terms of defense spending, in terms of social cohesion, even in terms of political stability. And that crisis has not gone away. It is actually expanding. But who is talking about it? We're all focused on this one crisis in Eastern Europe, but there's another crisis we're dealing with, and this was the origin. I come to the last part one of my short presentation. It was Ebola in 2014. We then returned to Abidjan, and I had to deal with a major crisis because I could see that because it was a localized pandemic in a little part of West Africa, it was not seen as a threat to global security of health. So, the Global North has a habit of discussing global health security in the following ways. If something is a threat to the Global North, like COVID, it is defined as a threat to global health security. If it affects a small part of the Global South, like was the case with Ebola, that is for philanthropy, development organizations, aid organizations. It's an issue of global health equity. And that issue of the distinction between global health equity, global health security is still here. We have to deal with it. I fast forward this, the last but one of those presentation. Then we had COVID. So, focus, global health security, not global health equity. As a result, no access to vaccines, no access to therapeutics, or even diagnostics. External support, I salute the IMF on this one. They did an excellent job. But really, what made the big difference, and I don't know if Rama is here and his team. Are you here, Benedict? It is African institutions which rose to the occasion, not global institutions. And this has very major consequence for our discussion today. This Afreximbank offered to us as African leaders to put in place a $2 billion line for countries to access vaccines, which could then be refinanced, hopefully, by the SDRs whenever they became available. So there were two issues. Thank you. I could also mention African Center for Disease Control, the African Medical Platform, African institutions. What happened then that we still have not made progress on the SDRs, but also we could not find vaccines, period. So the funding was there, but no vaccines. Some countries in the global north had 2-3 times the amount of vaccine they needed, but those vaccines were not available to us. So this would be, now, I keep saying my last, but this is the last but one. All right? So here is the crisis we're discussing now. So I want to say, it's a huge crisis. It has a huge significance. You have been discussing that today. It will be there for a long time. But please, let us not forget the crisis caused by pandemics. It is still here. The crisis caused by the Sahel, consequences of what happened in Libya, it is still here. Many countries in West Africa are focused on this for their social cohesion and stability. So, what are my conclusions? If I had time, I would develop these points. I don't have time. So what are the 3 challenges I see? Challenge number 1. Now with our economies contracting, we have to do everything we can to rebuild the economic buffers, shock absorbers for the next crisis. I'm sure the colleague from the IMF would be mentioning that. That requires huge balancing acts among our macroeconomic policy managers, whether it is subsidies, whether it is how you target them, whether it is your monetary policy. We need a lot of deft economic management at this time. Number 2 is about social protection. COVID has been so much discussed from a health perspective, but actually in many African countries, the impact was much more economic than health. Millions of people have flown back into poverty. numbers are still being estimated, but I do believe that anywhere above 300 million people will not be an exaggeration. Because it arrived at a time when many of our social protection schemes were quite weak. That is something we have again to try and rebuild. I don't know how exactly, but I think it is a problem. But the bigger issue is what Larry Summers has called a possible recurrence of divergence. African economies, from about 1950 all the way down to probably year 2000, were diverging with the rest of the world. At the turn of the millennium, we began the process of convergence. Not everywhere, but in most of the countries. The risk of divergence now is real because of pandemics, because of things I've been discussing, and the current crisis. And that will require a lot of things for us to do. So what are the two lessons? Lesson number one, look at this vaccine inequity. Look at the disruptions in the global supply chains, export bans. What does it say to us? So when countries say we are now going to manufacture vaccines, someone says, no, that is bad economics. Maybe. I'm not even sure about that. But now the issue, can we rely on those supply chains for things on which we depend, like food and vaccines? I look forward for the discussion on this one here. The second lesson that I want to stop on this one is that when there is a major international crisis, no one owes Africa a living. No one owes Africa a living. We are on our own. Now, that has implications, which I want to summarize the following, and I'll stop there. I can see Mr. Edo is shaking his head. Number one is, what do you do about the African institutions? I just mentioned the way Afreximbank tried their best. African Development Bank, African CDC, African Platform, because there was not enough multilateral support. Protectionism of sort was back. Rich countries were looking after their own. So the solution is two best. We need to fight to rebuild multilateralism, but at the same time, strengthen African institutions at national level, regional level, and continental level. Absolutely. It has to be done. I know the Exim Bank, I heard the head of the FC saying as well, it is time to recapitalize our institutions. We have no choice. It is time to refocus on Africa Center for Disease Control. We have no choice. Then I could go on and on. The Exim Bank is discussing here an issue of an African payment systems. I know there are a lot of technical legal issues which people are going through them, but surely, with what is happening in this crisis, is it not a time to work very hard to anchor an African payment systems, which here is being explained? Do we have to depend on the dollar and the euro all the time? Is it not time to say we actually have to rebuild our own capacity? I could go on and on. Let me talk about the African CFTA. So the CFTA now is in place. But we now have to make it a reality. Single African air market. Free movement of people. Not total, but free movement of people. Tariffs are a problem, but they are no longer the biggest problem. The big problem is the one I just mentioned, payment systems, digital platforms, visas, and so on. These are things we now have to accelerate. That is how we respond to this crisis, not to complain about them. This is how we deal with them. But then, this is my very, very last point, sir. You know, the art of policy making is crisis management plus fixing your eyes on the horizon, long term. We still have a lot of structural fault lines in Africa we have to address, whether it is agricultural productivity, education of our youth for the demographic dividend. Those things will not go away. So as we focus on the crisis, we must stay focused on the structural fault lines, whether around digital, climate, and so on. Countries who are successful plan for the long term and then build ability to handle crisis. I think there is a risk we could be consumed by the crisis and take our eye off the long term and the structural fault lines. And that would be quite risky. And finally, let us keep our eyes and ears on the mega trends around us. The world is multipolar, but what is Africa's place in that multipolar structure? That will depend on what we do at the African Union, at our regional organizations, continental banks like this one, and that we can do, that is in our grasp. One of the reasons I've come here, because the chair invited me, was to urge you, those who are members of this bank, and banks like the African Finance Corporation, like FDB, we have absolutely to do everything we can to give these institutions capacity. If we don't, we shall then be in the next crisis looking to international response, which will be not coming. Remember what I've told you, in terms of crisis, no one owes Africa a living. I end my case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Donald Kaberuka, Chairman of the Board of Directors, Southbridge. You know, you were implying that I wanted to get you off the stage, but nothing could be further from the truth, because I want to keep you on the stage. I want you to join me, and can you just sit down? I want you to just listen in. I'm going to have a panel, but I would love your learned attention. You don't have to do anything. You can relax. I can get you a glass of juice, whatever you like to relax. And if I could, you could just sit there and make up my five. I'm going to call 5 people now to the stage. This is the panel. Now, much has been said about the effects of the conflict in Ukraine. We heard some very interesting analysis earlier, and we've seen global wheat prices, sunflower oil prices soar to unprecedented levels almost overnight. And Africa is yet to when this hit us, we were yet to fully recover, and we still have not recovered from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic before this new threat reared its head. It's a direct threat to food security in Africa, there's no doubt about it, and to living standards in Africa. Most African households spend the majority of their income on food. And we know that Africa's GDP is going to shrink because of this Ukrainian. I think the calculation was by 0.7% from the fallout from this war. Inflation is skyrocketing. Today we may hear from the US that the Fed has put up rates. Could be 0.5 or 0.75, we don't know, but that will certainly make finance more expensive. It's going to be hard for countries to go to market to refinance. So it's almost like a perfect storm. To make sense of all this, I'm going to call on a very esteemed and learned panel in the form of, I'll begin with, well, let's start with our host nation, shall we? I'm going to call on His Excellency. You heard him make an excellent intervention at the top. His Excellency Tarek Hassan Amer, Governor of the Central Bank of Egypt. Thank you, sir. I'm going to ask you to take pride of place right here. Yes, or here, right here, either one. Yes, right there. Thank you, sir. Yes, exactly. So you can take that one there. I will now call on Dr. Papa Ndaye. Dr. Papa Ndaye is the Assistant Director, Africa Department at the IMF. So you could comfortably sit between these two titans right here. That's perfect. Right there. And the next person is a solutions-oriented individual. Solutions. He is the president of the Africa Finance Corporation, Mr. Samaila Zubairu. Mr. Samaila Zubairu. Sitting right next to me, I think. I'll make sure I'm not missing anybody. No, I'm not missing anybody. I'd like to invite His Excellency Dr. Denny Kalialia, who is the governor of the Bank of Zambia, Republic of Zambia. Your Excellency, please join us on the stage. And I do believe, yes, that makes up my cast of superheroes. I almost feel like I should be standing for this one. Marvelous. Gentlemen, I'm sorry, it's a manel. You know what a manel is? It's a panel with all men. So but next time I promise to address address that. Otherwise, okay. So I can take a seat next to you, gentlemen, and I'm going to go down the line. I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go down the line. So we heard a really interesting intervention there from Dr. Donald Kaberuka, really sort of setting the scene there. So I'm going to start. Central banks have got a tough job. They call this a perfect storm. A very tough job. Now, Zambia, Zambia defaulted on a debt in 2020. I mean, it's common knowledge here. This Ukraine crisis must really, really make it difficult because you're restructuring, aren't you? And so something like this, how does this impact your plans for restructuring?
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, moderator. First of all, allow me to thank our host for the wonderful hospitality that they have extended to us, and I thank also the organizers for giving me an opportunity to share some thoughts on the issues that have been raised. Indeed, Zambia is in a precarious position. For sure, it did default in 2020, and earlier we could see this coming, but there were very committed efforts to address the issue. So with COVID, that just worsened. So indeed, in 2020, September, we did default on our bond, and that became an official default. We had tried to apply for support under the various instruments from the BWIs. That was not going through. But I must say that finally we were able to get the debt service suspension initiative, which at least helped us not to service the bilateral and the other commercial debt. But obviously that we are the basis of that default is really a fiscal issue. And I think in the conversation here, there has been an allusion to the fact that the combination between fiscal and the monetary is extremely important. So we see that our problems of debt emanated from the fiscal side. But there is a general problem there in that many of our countries, they are all striving to get infrastructure. And I think Zambia is no exception that they borrowed some of that money to build the infrastructure. Now, the space for support for soft money is not there. We go to the big institutions, they don't have the money that you need, or they have the money, but the access is very difficult. So this, to us, I think it points to need for different thinking. But before I get to there, maybe just to zero in on the point you have raised of the impact that the Korean issue has added to that problem, is that we are in the process of doing a debt restructuring under the common framework, the G20 common framework. But unfortunately, to the words of Dr. Kaberuka, no one owes you anything. Because what we have found out is that attention kind of shifted. We had a staff level agreement early in December last year. Our expectation was that by April, we should be able to get the debt restructuring. But Ukraine overshadowed that.
And did you actually feel that? You're in discussions, okay, then suddenly, out of nowhere, this Ukrainian event happens, and you feel this sea change, almost. that's impacting the pace of your discussions and the progress?
I think it's very clear in that, you see, there is a divide. The West, Russia and its supporters, we owe both. So if they cannot sit and talk, how can they look at our situation? So it's a real issue. The focus shifted on finding solutions for Ukraine, and some solutions were being found, but we are made to wait. Only now are we seeing a official credit committee of the Paris Club actually meeting tomorrow. So it's very direct that there was this problem that put these players apart. So common framework was in test because we are the first country. I think there are two others, Ethiopia and Chad. But we are the first who are coming through the door who had defaulted. So everybody's waiting to see what happens to us. So it is very clear that the Ukraine situation and Russia conflict had a bearing because the voting also goes along that way. So, but if you allow me just to develop that point, it's in terms of the crisis. I think the point Donald raises is that I think crises are an every so often issue. But I think one of the challenges we have as a continent is really not thinking through long term. How do we avoid this? So crisis preparedness is really quite weak in our setups.
So you're talking about frameworks?
Not really, because you see, what happens at a country level, it's driven by election cycles. Yes. You know, so how do you have long-term kind of stance? So this, to some of us, brings to the fore the presence of institutions such as Afreximbank, the AFCTA that we have. I think for me, it presents a very opportune opportunity for us because these are showing that they can actually stand up and respond to the issues. So if we you mentioned the issue of PAPs, for example, this is a time to use that framework because I think everybody would agree. We may have different views at a country level, but at a continental level, it's very clear that this is a solution to many of our challenges.
Now you say the word solutions, a perfect segue to the gentleman there to your left. You were talking about doing things, Governor, differently. You were saying where are you going to capitalize? Where are you going to get the soft money? Who are your friends in this situation? I look across, I see Benedict Orama is there in the audience with you. And to your left, I see Africa Finance Corporation. We've got to do things differently. What are you doing in institutions like AFC in this current crisis? What are the sort of solutions you're looking at, Samaila Zubairu?
Thank you very much. I also want to join my other colleagues in commending my brother Benedict Orama, together with his team, for convening this event and getting us all here to discuss possible ways out of the solutions that we need to get over this crisis. I would like to start by acknowledging what we have achieved in Africa.